In this video, I'm going to talk about my first ride impressions of the Revel Rascal. This is the first time that I've ever ridden a Revel. I was recently on a business trip to Colorado Springs and I was able to get in a couple of days of riding. So I found a bike shop, Routes Outfitters, which rented Revel, and I was able to demo it on 2 separate days. So let's first talk about Revel in case you're not familiar with them. Revel is a relatively new bike company that's based in Colorado. It was started by a group of bike enthusiasts that really focus on the design of the suspension. They tout themselves as the most advanced full suspension mountain bike in the world. Revel makes fairly high-end bikes, and currently they only offer really 3 models, and all of them are carbon. They make the Ranger, which is 120 in the front, 115 in the back. It's a 29er, so that's kind of a shorter travel trail bike. And then they make the Rascal, which is a longer travel 29er, 140 in the front, 130 in the back. And then they make the Rail, which is a 27.5-inch wheeled mountain bike, which has 170 mil travel in the front and 165 in the back. So that one I would consider more of an enduro bike. Like I mentioned, Revel really focuses on the suspension design, particularly the leverage curve. They say that they find the perfect balance in the anti-squat and the anti-rise. Anti-squat is what gives the bike a firm pedaling platform. If the anti-squat is too high, then the bike's going to feel harsh, it's going to feel locked out. If the anti-squat is too low, the bike's going to have a lot of unwanted suspension movement when you're pedaling. And then anti-rise is focused on how the bike performs when it's braking. So if anti-rise is too low, the bike's not going to do a good job of counteracting your weight shift as you're braking. And then if the anti-rise is too high, the bike's going to feel too stiff when you're braking, and you're not going to get a lot of good traction when you're going downhill and braking. And by the way, Revel Bikes is a direct-to-consumer brand, but they also sell through bike shops, so you can purchase the bikes either way. And I also want to mention that the suspension design is borrowed from the Canfield brothers, so you may be familiar with Canfield bikes. Really good suspension design, so Revel has used that design in their bikes. All right, now let's talk about how the bike rides, which is the most important thing. Now, in this video, I don't have the bike with me, so I'm back at home. So unlike a lot of my other reviews where I'm standing behind the camera showing the bike as I talk, I'm gonna rely on photos and videos that I took when I was demoing the bike. So like I mentioned, I demoed the bike 2 days, and I'm glad I did, because the first day I took the bike out, the tire pressure was too high, and I forgot to ask the bike shop, Routes Outfitters, if they set up the bike as tubeless. So if it had tubes, I didn't want to let too much air out of the tires, and I was riding some pretty rocky terrain in Colorado Springs, and the bike was kind of skipping off the rocks. So the second day that I demoed the bike, I was able to make sure that it was tubeless, which it was, and then I used the shop pump to set the tire pressure where I wanted it, which was about 22 in the front and 24 in the back, which I felt was a good tire pressure for the terrain that I was riding. I'm not going to really talk too much about the build kit. I was riding the GX build kit, which sells for about $5,900. I did like the build kit. I had no issues at all with the components when I was riding. I'm not going to focus on the builds because there are a lot of builds, but I really want to talk about the frame, the suspension design, because you can buy a Revel as frame only, or you can get some various build kits all the way up to like $11,000. I'll first of all say that I felt like the Rascal was a good choice for the terrain that I was riding. There were some sections where I wish I had a lighter bike like the Ranger with less travel. But when I hit the technical rocky sections, I liked the amount of travel that I had, and I really liked the fact that it was a 29er. So, you know, 27.5 and 29, it's really a matter of choice. I think if you're riding smoother terrain and you want more of a flowy bike, 27.5 is the way to go. If you're riding more rocky terrain, chunky terrain, then 29ers are the way to go. So I'll just say that about 27.5 and 29. All right, let's talk about how this bike climbs first of all, because in Colorado Springs, you do a lot of climbing, and I felt like the suspension worked as declared. In other words, I felt like the bike in the saddle was a really good climbing bike. I felt no unwanted suspension movement. It accelerated well, and when I was climbing up kind of rocky, rough stuff, I felt like the bike absorbed those hits so that I was able to get good traction. Now, I did notice when I got out of the saddle that there was some bobbing in the suspension. I've noticed that you know, with any bike that you're getting up to 130 plus mil travel in the rear, you're going to get some suspension movement when you're climbing, and this bike was no exception. But in the saddle, this bike accelerated and climbed really well. It's at this point that I'll go ahead and mention a couple of the negatives with the bike. First of all, it did creak. And this was a demo bike, so it probably gets used and abused, and it's hard to maintain a demo fleet where they ride perfectly. But I did get a lot of creaking in the bike. I first thought it was the bottom bracket, but the more I rode it, I think it was the suspension pivot. So you probably could solve that with spraying some lube in the suspension pivots. I don't know, but it did have some creaking. I'm not going to fault that too much again because it was a demo bike. The other thing that I noticed that was a little bit of a negative, not too bad, is I did get some heel strikes. So I pedal with my toes out or heels in a little bit, and I did have my heels hitting the seat stay when my feet were coming around. It wasn't every time, but if I didn't really give attention to keeping my heels straighter, I did get a little bit of contact. Not everybody's going to have that issue. They have some pretty fat seat stays on that bike, and I did get some heel strikes, but not a big deal. It didn't really affect my ride or dampen the ride quality at all in any way. Another thing that I noticed is I felt like my weight was back slightly compared to some of the other bikes that I own, particularly Transition and Niner. So this bike, the Rascal, has a 75-degree seat tube angle, which is steeper than bikes from 5 years ago, but it's not quite as steep as some other bikes that I've ridden. And I didn't think that I would notice that, but I actually did. When I was climbing over more technical stuff, I felt like I wanted my weight just a little bit more forward, and it gave me slightly less confidence when climbing up like rock gardens. So those kind of rock gardens where you may make it, you may not, you're not quite sure, but you just go for it anyway. I had just slight less confidence than, for example, my Transition Sentinel. Maybe that's just because I didn't really have a lot of time to get used to the bike. The only thing that I could really think of, and when I was riding the bike, I was trying to put my finger on it, why I just didn't feel quite as confident over those rock gardens. And the only thing I can think of is it was a slightly slacker seat tube angle than some of the other bikes that I own. And of course, it was when I was climbing where I wanted a bike that was slightly less weight. Now, I didn't weigh the bike, but I could tell it, I don't know, I'd put it around 30 pounds. Don't quote me on that by any means, but it was not as light as like the Ranger would have been. And so that's where, I kind of wish I was able to ride the Ranger and the Revel to compare those. So I put the Ranger more along the lines of like the Transition Spur. So 120 in the front, 115 in the back. And so let's talk about the descending now. Coming down the mountain, the bike was awesome. It was balanced. Some of the stuff that we were descending is really loose. I mean, like some of the loosest stuff I've ever ridden, like pea-size gravel. And the bike it felt balanced on the descent. I felt like I could really whip the rear of the bike around if I needed to, and the bike didn't have unwanted flex. And if you look at the suspension, it really looks beefy, and that makes for a bike that's it's stiff laterally. And a laterally stiff bike makes for a confident bike, because when you're coming down through roots or rock gardens, the bike's not going to swim all over the place. It really allows you to hold the line well. The bike has a 66-degree head angle, which I feel like is a pretty good balance. So it's not super slack, and so when you're climbing, the bike's not totally moving all over the place. And then when you're descending, the bike is stable, but it's also playful. So it's a really nice balance, not too slack, not too steep. The wheelbase on the Revel Rascal on the medium is 1202 millimeters, which I think is a nice balance. I mean, it's definitely not a short wheelbase, but it's not excessively long. And that kind of adds to that balance that I felt on the descents, where again, the bike was stable, but still a playful bike. Like I could move that bike around really easily. And I think that speaks not only to the geometry, but also the amount of travel. So, bikes that are excessively long in travel, they're gonna be super stable, super confident over rough stuff, but they kind of lose that agility, that ability to just kind of feel the bike. That's kind of hard to explain, but it's a bike that you feel like you can control well and move around easily, and the Rascal really fit that bill. And I'll mention one more thing about climbing. So when there were a lot of switchbacks, or I had to accelerate, I had to, accelerate the bike hard to get up a ledge, a rock that I saw coming up in front of me, that's where I felt like the bike was a little bit cumbersome. But again, that kind of speaks to the amount of travel, like I mentioned before. And so bikes that are shorter travel, like the Ranger, like for example the Ibis Ripley, you feel like when you're climbing, the bike's more maneuverable. And so there were times when I was climbing where I felt like the Rascal was just a little bit cumbersome, but again, it's kind of the trade-off, right? So if you want a bike that's got more travel for the descents, it's not going to feel quite as agile or accelerate as well as a bike with shorter travel. I feel like that 140 in the front, 130 in the back is the perfect travel amount if you're just going out for a ride and you really don't know what you're going to encounter, which really was the type of riding that I was doing. That's why I chose the Rascal over the Ranger, because I just wanted to be prepared when it got chunky. And there definitely was some chunky sections on the trails that I was riding, and I felt like the Rascal handled it pretty well. So overall, I really liked the ride quality of the Rascal. As I mentioned before, there are trade-offs in geometry and the amount of travel, but I felt like for the most part, the Rascal was a really balanced bike. So again, the Revel bikes are pretty high-end, a lot of attention to detail. In fact, they have a lifetime, no questions asked warranty. And another example of the attention to detail is they say that they focus on the cable routing, and they say that you can route the cables through the bike in about a minute, which if you've ever tried to route cables through a bike that was not easy to do, you'll really appreciate that. So that'll wrap it up for this video. Let me know in the comments below if you've owned or ridden a Revel. How are they long-term? What are your experiences on them? Let me know, because like I said, Revel is a fairly new bike brand. It's one that I'm definitely new to, and I'd love to hear your comments below. Any other comments or questions for me, drop those below. Thanks for watching.